name's Natalie and I'm from the Parentmedic movement, and today I'm going to have a little chat to you about fevers. When parents come to our baby and child first aid sessions, one of the most common concerns is when their baby gets their first fever, and this can be a really scary time. It's also one of the most common things that has the biggest misconceptions on what to do and where to seek help from. So when your baby gets their first fever, which is bound to happen, for the first 3 months, it's really important that when they get that fever that you head to the GP or seek advice from a service like Nurse on Call. The reason being, from the under age of 3 months, they're not terribly amazing at controlling their own temperatures. So you always want to seek help and make sure that their health is okay. After the age of 3 months, some of the most common myths that you'll hear is that you must reduce the baby's temperature straight away. And some things that our parents and our grandparents may have done, like putting us in a cold bath, fanning us and cooling us, are no longer the current recommendations. The most current recommendations provided by the Royal Children's Hospital for fever for babies over the age of 3 months is not to actively try and reduce the temperature. The reason being is that fever is actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing, but we have to understand what the red flags are when our children get their first fever. We used to think fevers were a really bad thing because of something called febrile convulsions. And if you ask your parents if they ever experienced or saw a febrile convulsion when you were a child, they'll tell you it's one of the most scariest things they've seen. Febrile convulsions were thought of being a side effect of getting really high fever. So we were actively trying to reduce the temperature so a child wouldn't get a febrile convulsion. Some of the myths around febrile convulsions and high fevers were that you'd get permanent brain damage, that the heat would fry your brain, that would cause serious injury, and sometimes we actually believe that it would cause death. What we know now, though, is febrile convulsions aren't as serious as we once thought, as much as they're as scary as they look. When a child gets a febrile convulsion, it is very similar to a seizure, and it's caused by high temperatures. But the one thing that we know is that children are either prone to getting them or not. And we also know that trying to reduce the temperature will most likely not stop the febrile convulsion from occurring. The other thing that we know about febrile convulsions is that there is no long-term damage, and it's not going to create any health problems in the child after the febrile convulsion occurring. If your child is prone to getting febrile convulsions or they get their first seizure, it is important, no matter what the cause, that you call emergency services straight away. If your child isn't prone to getting febrile convulsions or has no previous medical history and they get their first fever, these are the current recommendations as mentioned by the Royal Children's Hospital. You can always jump on their website. They have amazing resources for parents called Kids Health Info, and they also have an app that you can use and you can question them about anything and what the current recommendations are. The current recommendations for fever at this current point in time, if your child is over the age of 3 months, is 1, only using medications such as paracetamol for relieving pain and if the child is irritable, not to use the medication to reduce the temperature. The second most current recommendation is not to try and reduce the temperature by cooling the child. That means no fanning, no cooling, no putting them in cold water, just making sure that the child is comfortable. Some of the red flags for fever, if your child was to get their first fever, that I'd want you to look out for, is if they're not eating and drinking. When your baby gets their first fever, you need to look at some of the red flags. The red flags that we teach our participants in our baby and child first aid sessions are not eating and drinking properly. It is really important that your infant is drinking enough fluids when they have a fever. The younger they are, the more vital that is. And you can tell if they're not drinking properly if they have a reduced amount of wet nappies. This is something you know as a parent. They'd have a normal set amount of wet nappies a day, and if that's reduced in any shape or form and they have a fever and they're irritable, that's a red flag that you probably need to seek help. One of the other red flags is that they're having difficulty breathing. So if they have a fever, they're irritable and they're having any sort of difficulty of breathing, again, that is a red flag to seek help. And another red flag is if your child has a rash that's associated with the fever and possibility of having sensitivity to light. These are the main red flags for fever. What's most important to take from this video is that fevers aren't necessarily a bad thing. They're actually a good thing that's there to fight off the virus that's within our bodies. The second most important thing to take away from this video is not to be using medications such as paracetamol to reduce the temperature. That is there for the pure purpose of making the child more comfortable and less irritable. The third thing to take away from this video is making sure that you understand what the red flags are. So that is if your child is not eating and drinking properly, they're more irritable than normal, or they're having any difficulties breathing, or they might possibly have a rash. These are all red flags that you want to seek help. One of the most common questions we get from parents around fever is also, what is a temperature? Now, any health professionals will say that around about 38 degrees and over would indicate that someone has a temperature. Do you need to buy a super expensive thermometer? Probably not. The thermometers that we recommend are actually your cheap digital thermometers, and they're most accurate. The one thing that I want you guys to consider, however, it's not about the temperature, it's about the child. You can have a child who has a really high temperature, but that is eating and drinking and still playing, and that is of no concern. Whereas you can have a child who has a lower temperature, who's not eating and drinking, and that would be a concern. So when you're checking your child's temperature, just remember it's not about the number, and your aim isn't about reducing that number. Your aim is making sure that your child is comfortable eating and drinking and they're well whilst they have a fever. When your baby gets their first fever, try not to be scared. There are so many support services around, but one of the ways of being more prepared is making sure that you do a baby and child first aid session. The Parentmedic movement is a global movement of 80 or more health professionals around the world. And our mission is to make sure that every single parent in the world has access to education. So when your baby does get their first fever or any other illness, you know exactly what to do. My name's Natalie and I'm from the Parentmedic movement. If you'd like to find more information, please go to our website, parentmedic.co.